My parents ignored me for 12 years after the divorce. Then one envelope changed their entire story. My name is Hadley Vasquez, and I'm 27 years old. For 12 years after my parents' divorce, both of them treated me like a piece of mail addressed to a previous tenant, something that arrived occasionally and was set aside without being opened. My father missed 11 of my 12 birthdays. My mother attended my high school graduation for 16 minutes before leaving early for her stepson's baseball game. Neither of them came to my college graduation. Neither of them met the man I dated for 2 years in my early 20s. Neither of them knew my address until I gave it to them, in writing, when I was 26. And even then, neither of them ever visited. I work as a mail carrier for the United States Postal Service in Burlington, Vermont. I deliver envelopes for a living. I have spent 6 years walking the same routes through the same neighborhoods, putting letters into the hands of people who often do not know what is inside the envelopes I bring them. I know, better than most people, that an envelope can change a life. Most envelopes do not, but occasionally one does. 8 months ago, an envelope arrived in my own mailbox. It was a certified letter from a law firm in Burlington. It contained a notification that my grandmother had died and had named me as the sole beneficiary of her estate, valued at approximately $290,000. It also contained a handwritten letter from my grandmother explaining why she had made the choice she had made. The letter named, in calm and specific language, the pattern of abandonment she had watched my parents perform on me for 12 years, and it instructed me, gently, on how to use the inheritance to free myself from the people who had been pretending to be my family. If you've ever been ignored by both of your parents after a divorce, if you've ever spent your teenage years and 20s watching the people who created you build new families that did not include you, this story is for you. Like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, who was the one relative who stayed when everyone else left? I want to hear their name. Let me take you back. Before the envelope. Before the will. Back to a kitchen in South Burlington, Vermont, where I learned that a marriage can end in 2 different ways, and where I learned which way mine would end too. Quietly, by being forgotten. I grew up in South Burlington, Vermont, in a 2-story colonial on Spear Street, with green shutters and a maple tree in the front yard that turned the color of fire every October. My father, Reed Vasquez, was a regional sales manager for a medical device company that covered northern New England. My mother, Camille Vasquez, was a hospital administrator at the University of Vermont Medical Center. They were both ambitious. They were both busy. They were both, in their own ways, more invested in their careers than in their marriage, and by the time I was 12 years old, I had figured out, without anyone telling me, that the silences at our dinner table were not the silences of comfort. I was an only child. I think both of my parents had wanted more children at some point, but the marriage had not survived long enough to produce them. I was the entire weight of their parenting, and during the years when the marriage was failing, I was also the entire audience for their failure. I watched it happen from the kitchen table. My father moved out the summer I was 14. He did it on a Saturday in July, while I was at a friend's house for a sleepover. I came home Sunday morning and found my mother in the kitchen and the house quieter than I had ever heard it. She told me, in the calm, administrative voice she used at work, that my father had decided to leave the marriage and that he had moved into an apartment in Winooski. She told me they had been working toward this for some time. She told me everything was going to be fine. Everything was not going to be fine. But I was 14 years old and I had no framework for divorce, and I believed her. The legal divorce was finalized 11 months later. I was almost 15. I lived primarily with my mother in the house on Spear Street, and I saw my father every other weekend at his apartment in Winooski. The visits were strained from the beginning. My father was distracted, often on his phone, often checking his watch. He took me to dinner at the same chain restaurants every visit. He asked me the same 3 questions about school. He never asked me how I was actually doing. I do not think it occurred to him to ask. He had filed me, mentally, into a category of obligation that needed to be fulfilled twice a month and not thought about in between. Within 6 months of the divorce, my father started dating a woman named Whitney. Whitney was an account executive at a marketing firm in Burlington. She was 38 years old, recently divorced, with 2 young children, a 4-year-old boy and a 6-year-old girl. My father introduced me to Whitney and her children at a brunch in Williston 4 months after they started dating. Whitney was polite to me in the careful, slightly cool way that women who are dating divorced fathers are polite to teenage daughters from previous marriages. The children were small and noisy. My father spent most of the brunch helping Whitney's 6-year-old cut her pancakes. My mother met someone too. His name was Garrett, and he was a hospital administrator from a different department at UVM. He was 46, divorced, with one teenage son named Tucker who was 16 at the time. My mother introduced me to Garrett at our dinner table about 8 months after my father had moved out. Garrett shook my hand and told me he was glad to meet me. Tucker did not come to that first dinner. Tucker, I would learn, was a high school baseball player who had a busy schedule of games and practices, and Tucker would become, over the next several years, the secondary subject of every conversation I had with my mother. By the time I was 16, my father had married Whitney, and her children had moved into a new house with him in Shelburne. By the time I was 17, my mother had married Garrett, and Garrett and Tucker had moved into the house on Spear Street. By the time I was 18, I had 2 step-parents I barely knew, 3 step-siblings I had not asked for, and 2 parents who were busy building new families that did not have a clear place for me in them. I left for the University of Vermont at 18, on a partial scholarship and a federal student loan. I lived in the dorms for 2 years, and then in an apartment near the university for 2 more years. I went home occasionally during my freshman year, and almost never after that. My mother did not ask me to come home for holidays. My father did not ask me to come for holidays either. The first Thanksgiving I spent alone in my apartment, eating a turkey sandwich and watching old movies on my laptop. I cried for about an hour, and then I called my grandmother, Estela, my father's mother, and she talked to me for 90 minutes about nothing in particular and made me feel less alone than I had felt in months. That phone call was the beginning of the only relationship that mattered during the 12 years that followed. My grandmother, Estela, became, quietly, monthly, by handwritten letter, the only person in my biological family who continued to act like I existed. And when she died, 12 years after the divorce that had erased me from my parents' lives, she made sure that her love for me would have one final, undeniable consequence. The pattern of being ignored set in slowly, the way most patterns do. In the first year after the divorce, both of my parents made some effort. My father called every couple of weeks. My mother organized weekend activities. The effort was real, even if it was performed more out of duty than affection. By the second year, the calls had become less frequent. By the third year, they had become rare. By the fourth year, the only consistent contact I had with my father was a card on my birthday signed in Whitney's handwriting with Reed's name printed underneath. I want to be specific about what 12 years of being ignored actually looked like, because the abstract version sounds like an exaggeration, and the specific version sounds like a slow, ordinary erosion that anyone could miss while it was happening. My father missed 11 of my 12 birthdays between 15 and 26. The one he attended was my 18th, and he attended it for 40 minutes at a small dinner my mother had organized. He arrived late, ate quickly, gave me a card with $200 in it, and left to drive back to Shelburne for Whitney's daughter's school recital. My mother attended my high school graduation for 16 minutes. She arrived during the processional, sat in the back row, and left before the diplomas had been handed out because Tucker had a baseball game across town that started at the same time. Neither of my parents attended my college graduation from UVM. My father told me he had a work conference. My mother told me she had a hospital board meeting that had been scheduled months in advance. I sat in the audience at the Patrick Gymnasium with my best friend's family, who had driven up from Massachusetts to watch their own daughter graduate, and they invited me to dinner with them afterward. And I spent my college graduation evening eating pasta with someone else's family. I stopped expecting my parents to show up to anything by the time I was 21. I stopped inviting them by the time I was 23. By 25, the only contact I had with either of them was a perfunctory text exchange every couple of months, usually initiated by me, usually answered with a one-line reply. "Hi, sweetie. Busy week? Hope you're doing well." That was the standard response. I do not believe either of my parents knew where I worked, what my apartment looked like, what my friends' names were, or what I cared about. They had outsourced the work of knowing me to themselves, and they had not done the work. Both of them told a different story to other people. I learned this slowly, over years, through small comments from extended family and from friends of my parents who occasionally crossed paths with me at weddings or funerals. The story my father told Whitney's family was that I was estranged by choice, that I had pulled away from him after the divorce, and that he had been heartbroken but had respected my space. The story my mother told Garrett's family was similar but slightly different, that I had struggled with the divorce and had become distant, and that she had been working patiently to maintain a connection, but I had needed time. Both of these stories cast me as the agent of distance and themselves, as the patient parents waiting for me to come around. Neither story was true. I had not pulled away. I had been left behind. There is a difference, and the difference matters, because the people who tell you that you pulled away from them are often the people who quietly stopped reaching for you and then renamed your absence as your decision. The one consistent presence in my life during those 12 years was my grandmother Estella. Estella Vasquez was my father's mother. She was 73 when my parents divorced, and 85 when she died. She had been born in Puebla, Mexico, and had immigrated to the United States in her early 20s with my grandfather Antonio, who had died of cancer when I was 9. After Antonio's death, Estella had lived alone in a small house in Essex Junction, about 15 minutes from where I grew up in South Burlington. She had worked for 40 years as a seamstress at a tailor's shop in Burlington, retiring at 68. She spoke English with a soft accent that had never fully gone away, and she wore her gray hair in a long braid down her back, and she made the best mole sauce I have ever tasted from a recipe her own grandmother had given her in the 1950s. My grandmother Estela had not approved of how my father handled the divorce. I learned this slowly. She did not say it directly to me at first. She was too loyal to her son to criticize him to his daughter. But I could tell, from the way she watched my father interact with me during the rare family gatherings of my early teenage years, that she was paying attention to something the rest of the adults were missing. She would catch my eye across the table at Thanksgiving and give me a small, specific smile that meant, "I see you, mija, and I am sorry." When I went away to UVM at 18, my grandmother started writing me letters. Not emails. Handwritten letters, on the small-lined stationery she had been using for decades, sealed in pale yellow envelopes addressed in her careful cursive to my dorm room and then to my apartment. The first letter arrived during my first month of college. It was 3 pages long. It told me about her week, about the tomatoes in her garden, about a movie she had watched on a Spanish-language channel, about the weather. It ended with the sentence, "I am thinking of you every day, Hadley. I hope you are eating well and sleeping enough. Your grandmother loves you. Estella, I wrote back. Of course I wrote back. I wrote her a letter that same afternoon, sitting on my dorm bed, and I told her about my classes and my roommate, and the strange noises the radiator made at night. She wrote me back. The next letter arrived 2 weeks later. The letter after that arrived 3 weeks after the second one. By the end of my freshman year, we had established a rhythm. One letter from her per month, one letter from me in reply. We kept that rhythm for 12 years. She never missed a month. Not one. Not even when she was sick. Not even when she was tired. The first of every month, a pale yellow envelope arrived in my mailbox, addressed in her careful cursive, and inside was a handwritten letter that was sometimes long and sometimes short, but was always specifically for me. I kept every one of them. I kept them in a wooden box under my bed. The box was a small cedar chest I had bought at a thrift store on Pine Street my freshman year of college, originally intended to hold sweaters. I had reassigned it within a month to hold the letters from my grandmother. By the time she died, the box contained 144 letters, 12 letters per year, 12 years. My entire adult life recorded in the careful cursive of a woman who had watched my parents abandon me and had decided, quietly and without announcement, to be the one person who would not. I did not know, until the envelope from the law firm arrived 8 months ago, that my grandmother had been doing more than writing me letters. I did not know that she had updated her will 5 years before her death to name me as her sole beneficiary. I did not know that she had explained the choice in a letter to her own attorney, Wendell Pritchard, that he kept on file alongside the will. I did not know that the woman who had been writing me letters for 12 years had also been preparing, very carefully, for the day when she would no longer be alive to write them, and had decided that her final letter to me would be the one that finally made my parents see what they had done. My grandmother Estella died on a Wednesday in September. She was 85 years old. She died in her sleep at her small house in Essex Junction, the way she had always told me she hoped she would die. Quietly, in her own bed, in the home where she had lived for 40 years. Her neighbor found her the next morning when she did not come out for her usual 7 a.m. walk around the block. I found out about her death from my father, of all people. He called me at 11:14 a.m. that Thursday, while I was on my mail route in the Old North End. His voice on the phone was the practiced, slightly formal voice he used for important news that he did not want to deliver with too much emotion. "Hadley, it's Dad. I'm calling because Grandma Estella passed away last night. The funeral will be on Saturday. I'll text you the details." The call lasted 41 seconds. I sat down on the curb outside a triple-decker on Park Street, and I cried for about 10 minutes. Then I finished my mail route because that is what mail carriers do when they receive news on the route. And I went home to my apartment and I called the funeral home in Essex Junction to confirm the details myself, because I did not trust my father to send them. The funeral was small, about 30 people. Most of them were elderly women from Estella's church, and a few of her former co-workers from the tailor shop. My father was there, with Whitney and her 2 children, who were now 11 and 13 and looked bored. My mother did not attend. My father gave a brief eulogy that touched lightly on Estella's life and emphasized her strong faith and her love of family. He did not mention me. I sat in the second row of the small chapel, and I cried quietly for a woman who had written me 144 letters and who had been the only person in my biological family who had treated me like I existed. After the funeral, my father and Whitney came over to me briefly. My father hugged me, the first physical contact I had had with him in over a year, and told me to let him know if I needed anything. Whitney offered her condolences. The children stood behind their parents and looked at their phones. Then they left. The whole interaction took less than 3 minutes. My father did not tell me anything about the estate, the will, or what would happen next. I do not think it occurred to him that I might have any role in what came next, because in his version of the family, I had been a peripheral figure for 12 years, and there was no reason to imagine I would suddenly become central. The certified letter arrived at my apartment 11 days later. I came home from my mail route on a Tuesday afternoon and found a delivery notice taped to my door. A certified letter requiring signature was waiting for me at the post office annex on St. Paul Street. I went to pick it up that evening after my shift. The clerk handed me a plain white envelope with the return address of a law firm I did not recognize, Pritchard and Associates, attorneys at law, Burlington, Vermont. I opened the envelope at the small standing counter near the post office exit. I could not wait to get home. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a formal notification on the law firm's letterhead. It was signed by Wendell Pritchard, attorney at law, and it informed me that I was named as the sole beneficiary of the estate of Estela Maria Vasquez, deceased, and that the estate had a current valuation of approximately $290,000, including her house in Essex Junction, her savings accounts, and her personal belongings. The notification asked me to contact the firm at my earliest convenience to begin the probate and transfer process. I read the notification 3 times. I did not understand it. My grandmother had 3 living relatives that I knew of: my father, my Aunt Rosalba in Texas, and me. I had assumed, without thinking about it, that her estate would go to her children. The notification said clearly that I was the sole beneficiary, not a partial beneficiary, the sole. The second document was a copy of the relevant section of my grandmother's will, dated 5 years before her death. The section read, "I, Estela Maria Vasquez, being of sound mind and full legal capacity, hereby direct that the entirety of my estate, including but not limited to my real Gake property at 47 Pine Street in Essex Junction, Vermont, my financial accounts, my personal belongings, and any other assets I possess at the time of my death, be transferred in full to my granddaughter, Hadley Vasquez, born September 12, 1997. I am making this designation deliberately and after careful consideration. My son, Reed Vasquez, and my former daughter-in-law, Camille Vasquez, are explicitly excluded as beneficiaries of any portion of this estate. My daughter, Rosalba Vasquez Mendez, is also excluded, as she is financially comfortable and has herself agreed in conversations with me that Hadley should receive my estate. My reasons for this designation are explained in a separate letter that accompanies this will and is to be delivered to Hadley, along with the formal notification of her inheritance. The third document was the separate letter, 5 pages, handwritten, in my grandmother's careful cursive on the same pale yellow stationery she had been using for 12 years to write to me. I stood at the standing counter in the post office annex on St. Paul Street, and I read my grandmother's final letter to me. I will not share the entire letter. Some of it is for me, but I will share the parts that matter, because they are the parts that explain why what happened next happened the way it did. The letter began the way her letters always began, with my name and a small greeting. Hadley, Mija, if you are reading this, I have died, and Wendell has done the work I asked him to do. She told me she loved me. She told me that the 12 years of monthly letters had been the most consistent joy of her old age. She told me that knowing I had read them and written back had given her something to look forward to every month for the entire decade and more after my parents had divorced. Then the letter shifted into the harder material. I have watched your father and your mother treat you since their divorce in a way I have not been able to forgive. I love my son. I will love him until the moment I die, but I have not been able to look at him the same way since I started watching how he handled you after he left your mother. He chose his new wife, and her children over you. He did this slowly, in small decisions that added up to a complete abandonment, and I do not believe he ever once stopped to see what he was doing. Your mother did the same with her new husband and his son. I watched both of them perform the role of busy modern parents while quietly filing you out of their lives. I did not say anything to either of them, because I am an old woman from a generation that did not confront, and because I was afraid that if I confronted my son, he would cut me off too, and you would lose the one person in the family who was still writing to you. So I stayed quiet, and I wrote you letters every month, and I waited. She told me what she had done with the will. She told me she had updated it 5 years earlier specifically because she had realized that year that my parents were not going to repair what they had broken, and that I was going to need something that would let me live independently of them when the time came. She told me the house in Essex Junction was paid off. She told me her savings were in a money market account at a credit union in Burlington and that Wendell would help me access them. She told me to keep the house if I wanted it, or sell it if I did not, that the choice was mine, and that she had no preference. And then, in the second to last paragraph of the letter, she gave me an instruction. I am asking one thing of you, Hadley. I am asking you to let Wendell Pritchard read the relevant portions of my will and this letter aloud at a small family gathering to mark my death. Not the funeral, a separate gathering, organized by you, with your father and your mother, and their new spouses present. I have asked Wendell to coordinate with you on this. I want them to hear, in the room, in front of each other, why their mother and former mother-in-law made the choice she made. I do not want this to be a confrontation. I want it to be a record. The truth has lived in private long enough. It deserves to be spoken once, in a room where the people who created it have to listen. After that, you may do whatever you wish with the inheritance and with your relationship to your parents. I am giving you the freedom to choose, Mija. That is the gift I am leaving you, more than the money. The letter ended with the sentence she had ended every one of her 144 monthly letters with. Your grandmother loves you, Estella. I stood at the standing counter in the post office annex for a long time. I did not cry. I had cried at the funeral, and I would cry again later, but standing there with my grandmother's final letter in my hand, what I felt was something quieter and stronger than grief. I felt the specific clarity that comes when someone who loved you has done the work of preparing you for a moment you did not yet know was coming. I called Wendell Pritchard's office the next morning at 8 a.m. Wendell Pritchard's office was on the second floor of a small brick building on College Street in downtown Burlington. I drove there on Friday morning, 2 days after the certified letter arrived, for the appointment his receptionist had scheduled for me. The office was small and old-fashioned, wood-paneled walls, leather chairs, framed diplomas from the University of Vermont and Boston College Law School, a bookshelf full of legal texts that looked like they had been there since the 1980s. Wendell met me at the door. He was 64 years old, tall and slightly stooped, with silver hair and reading glasses on a chain around his neck. He wore a tweed jacket over a button-down shirt and a green knit tie. He shook my hand formally and then, after a brief pause, he said, Hadley, your grandmother spoke about you for 20 years. I have been waiting to meet you. I sat down, in the leather chair across from his desk. He poured me a cup of coffee from a small pot behind him. He sat down. He folded his hands on the desk. Your grandmother was my client for 20 years. She came to me first to update her will after your grandfather Antonio died, and she came back to me 5 more times over the years to make additional updates. The most significant update was the one she made 5 years ago, when she changed the primary beneficiary from her 2 children to you. I want to tell you something about that conversation, Hadley, because I think you should know. I nodded. Your grandmother came into this office on a Tuesday morning in October of that year. She sat in the chair you are sitting in right now. She told me she wanted to update her will to leave everything to her granddaughter. I asked her why. She told me she had been watching her son and her former daughter-in-law treat you in a way that she could no longer ignore. She said, and I am quoting her as closely as I can remember, "Wendell, my son has stopped being a father to my granddaughter. My granddaughter is 22 years old and she has been alone in the world for 8 years, and nobody in our family except me has even noticed. I am going to fix this in the only way I still have the power to fix things. I am going to leave her everything. And when I die, I want you to make sure she knows it was a deliberate choice." Wendell took off his reading glasses and set them on the desk. "I have been a probate attorney for 41 years, Hadley. I have drafted hundreds of wills. I can tell you that most people who change a will to favor one family member over others do it out of anger or out of confusion or out of pressure from somebody else. Your grandmother was not angry, she was not confused, and there was nobody pressuring her. She was the most clear-headed client I have ever had on the day she made that change. She knew exactly what she was doing. She had been thinking about it for years. She told me she had wanted to change the will earlier, but had been waiting until you were old enough to handle the inheritance responsibly. When you turned 22, she decided you were ready." I did not know what to say. I drank some of the coffee. "Now, I want to talk about what your grandmother asked of you in her letter, the family gathering. She and I discussed this in detail when she was planning everything. She did not want a confrontation. She did not want shouting. She wanted what she called a record, a single moment, in a room with the relevant people, where the truth would be spoken aloud and witnessed. She asked me to be present at the gathering and to read the relevant sections of the will and the letter myself, in my professional capacity, so that the reading would carry the formal weight of an attorney delivering legal information rather than a granddaughter making accusations. She wanted to protect you from being cast as the angry one. She wanted the documents to speak for themselves. How do we organize it? I would suggest a small dinner at a private room at a restaurant, somewhere neutral. Not your apartment, not your father's house, not your mother's house. You invite both of your parents and their current spouses. You frame the invitation as a memorial gathering to honor your grandmother's memory, which is true, and to share some matters related to her estate. You do not explain in advance what the matters are. You do not give anyone the chance to prepare a defense. You simply invite them to dinner and you tell them the family lawyer will be present. They will come? They will come. Both of them. Your father will come because he assumes he is inheriting his mother's estate, and he wants to be present when the details are discussed. Your mother will come because your father will tell her about the dinner, and she will not want to be excluded from anything that involves the estate, even though she is no longer technically family. The new spouses will come because their spouses will bring them. I have seen this dynamic in dozens of estates over the years. The promise of an inheritance brings people to dinners they would otherwise refuse. I thought about it. The plan was clean. It was procedural. It was the kind of plan a careful old woman who had spent 40 years as a seamstress would have approved of. Every stitch placed deliberately, every seam reinforced, the whole garment built to hold its shape under pressure. "Wendell, I want to do it. Help me set it up." We spent the next hour planning the dinner. We chose a small restaurant on Church Street called the Magnolia Room that had a private dining room available for parties of up to 12. We chose a date 3 weeks out, a Saturday evening in early October, far enough from the funeral that it would not feel rushed, but close enough that the estate matters would still feel current. Wendell would call the restaurant to make the reservation in the name of the law firm. I would call my parents personally, both of them, and invite them with their spouses to a small memorial dinner to honor my grandmother and to discuss matters related to her estate. I made both calls that afternoon from Wendell's office, on speaker. with Wendell listening so he could verify what I said and what they said. My father answered on the fourth ring. I told him about the dinner. I used the language Wendell had given me: memorial gathering, family attorney present, matters related to Grandma's estate. My father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the carefully neutral voice he used for surprising news, "Of course, Hadley. Whitney and I will be there." "What time?" I told him. He said he would put it on the calendar. The call took 90 seconds. I called my mother next. She picked up on the second ring, sounding distracted. I gave her the same script. There was a longer pause from her end of the line, the pause of a woman, recalculating her expectations in real time. Then she said, "Hadley, that's so thoughtful of you. Garrett and I will be there. Should we bring anything?" "No, Mom. Just yourselves. The lawyer will handle everything else." The phrase, "the lawyer will handle everything else," did exactly what Wendell had predicted it would do. It activated in both of my parents the assumption that there was something to be handled, something worth showing up for. Both of them committed within 90 seconds of being asked. Neither of them asked any follow-up questions about what the dinner was actually for. Both of them assumed they knew. Wendell looked at me across the desk after I hung up the second call. He gave me a small, careful smile. "They will be there, Hadley. Now you have 3 weeks to prepare yourself. I will handle the documents. You handle your own steadiness. The hardest part of the gathering will not be hearing the truth read aloud. The hardest part will be watching your parents hear it and recognize that it is true. I want you to be ready for that." I drove home that evening to my apartment on Loomis Street. I sat on my bed. I pulled the cedar chest out from under it and opened the lid and looked at 144 pale yellow envelopes stacked neatly inside. 3 weeks. I had 3 weeks to be ready. The Magnolia Room was a small restaurant on Church Street in downtown Burlington, 2 blocks from the marketplace. It occupied the ground floor of a brick building that had once been a bank, and it had kept some of the original architectural details: high tin ceilings, tall arched windows, a marble fireplace at the back of the main dining room. The private dining room was off to one side, separated from the main restaurant by a heavy wooden door. It had a single round table that seated 8, soft pendant lighting overhead, and a window that looked out onto Church Street and the Saturday evening foot traffic. I arrived at 5:45 p.m. for a 6 o'clock reservation. Wendell Pritchard arrived 2 minutes after I did, carrying a leather portfolio under his arm. He was wearing the same tweed jacket he had worn at our first meeting. He greeted me at the door of the private dining room with a small, steady nod. "Hadley, are you ready?" "As ready as I am going to be." "You look composed. That is what your grandmother would have wanted. Composed, not angry. Let the documents do the work." The table had been set for 6. Wendell took the seat at one end. I took the seat at the other end. We left the 4 middle seats for my parents and their spouses. The leather portfolio sat on the table in front of Wendell, closed but visible. I had brought one item with me: a single pale yellow envelope, the most recent letter my grandmother had written to me before she died. It sat on the table in front of me, also closed. My father arrived first with Whitney at 6:04 p.m. He was wearing a navy blazer and gray slacks. Whitney was wearing a deep red dress and pearl earrings and the kind of carefully polite expression women wear when they have been brought to events that involve their husband's previous family. They came into the private dining room and Reed hugged me, quickly, the kind of hug a man gives an adult daughter he sees twice a year, and then introduced Whitney to me as if we had not already met 7 times over 12 years. Whitney smiled and shook my hand. They sat down across the table from each other on either side of Wendell's end. My mother arrived at 6:11 p.m. with Garrett. My mother was wearing a black blazer and a cream blouse, her hair pulled back in a low bun. Garrett was wearing a button-down shirt without a jacket and the slightly uncomfortable expression of a man who had been brought to a family event that did not involve his actual family. My mother hugged me, slightly longer than my father had, and told me she was glad I had organized this. She introduced Garrett to me, also as if we were meeting for the first time. They sat down on either side of me at the other end of the table. The geography of the table did the work of telling the story. My father and Whitney clustered at Wendell's end. My mother and Garrett clustered at my end. The two camps separated by the four middle seats and the round wood between them. It was the seating arrangement of a family that had not been a family for 12 years, and that was now being asked to perform the brief ritual of one. Wendell waited until everyone was seated. Then he stood up briefly and introduced himself. Good evening, everyone. My name is Wendell Pritchard. I am an attorney with Pritchard and Associates here in Burlington. I was Estella Vasquez's lawyer for 20 years. Hadley invited me to be present tonight because there are some matters related to Estella's estate that need to be communicated formally to the family, and Estella specifically asked that I be the one to communicate them. Before we eat, I would like to invite Hadley to share a few words about her grandmother. Then I will read some short sections from Estella's will and from a letter she left behind. After that, we will have dinner and we can talk about whatever the family wishes to talk about. Hadley? I stood up. My legs were steady. My hands were steady. I had been preparing for this moment for 3 weeks, and the moment, when it arrived, felt smaller and more manageable than I had feared. Thank you all for coming tonight. I want to start by saying that I loved my grandmother Estella very much. She was, in many ways, the most consistent presence in my life from the time I was 15 years old until the day she died. She wrote me a letter every month for 12 years, 144 letters total. I kept every one of them. They are in a wooden box under my bed in my apartment on Loomis Street, and I read them sometimes when I need to remember what it feels like to be loved by someone in my biological family, without conditions and without effort. The room was quiet. My father was looking at his water glass. Whitney was watching me carefully. My mother had her hands folded in her lap. Garrett was looking at the wall. My grandmother wrote those letters because she had decided, at some point during the year my parents got divorced, that I was going to need her in a way that she wanted to be ready for. She did not announce this decision to anyone. She just started writing. The first letter arrived in my dorm room at UVM during my freshman year of college, and the last letter arrived in my mailbox in August of this year, 3 weeks before she died. The letters are not what tonight is about, but I wanted you to know they exist, because they are part of what made my grandmother who she was, and because they are part of why we are here tonight. I sat down. I nodded to Wendell. He stood up and opened the leather portfolio. Thank you, Hadley. I am going to read 2 short sections now. The first is from Estella Vasquez's will, which was last updated 5 years ago. The second is from a letter Estella wrote to Hadley, which was delivered to Hadley along with the formal notification of her inheritance. I will read only the relevant portions. Both documents are in their entirety on file with my office and are available to any family member who wishes to review them in full. Wendell put on his reading glasses. He lifted the first document. From the last will and testament of Estela Maria Vasquez, dated October of 5 years ago. Quote, I, Estela Maria Vasquez, being of sound mind and full legal capacity, hereby direct that the entirety of my estate, including but not limited to my real property at 47 Pine Street in Essex Junction, Vermont, my financial accounts, my personal belongings, and any other assets I possess at the time of my death, be transferred in full to my granddaughter, Hadley Vasquez. I am making this designation deliberately and after careful consideration. My Son Reed Vasquez and my former daughter-in-law Camille Vasquez are explicitly excluded as beneficiaries of any portion of this estate. End quote. The room had gone very still in the specific way rooms go still when something has just been said that cannot be unsaid. My father's face had not yet moved. Whitney had set her water glass down very carefully. My mother's hands had unfolded slightly in her lap. Garrett was still looking at the wall, but his shoulders had become rigid. Wendell continued without pausing. I am now going to read from the letter Estella wrote to Hadley. I will read only one paragraph, which Estella specifically marked in her own handwriting as the paragraph she wanted read aloud at this gathering. Quote. He turned the page in the leather portfolio. I have watched your father and your mother treat you since their divorce, in a way I have not been able to forgive. I love my son. I will love him until the moment I die. But I have not been able to look at him the same way since I started watching how he handled you after he left your mother. He chose his new wife and her children over you. He did this slowly, in small decisions that added up to a complete abandonment, and I do not believe he ever once stopped to see what he was doing. Your mother did the same with her new husband and his son. I watched both of them perform the role of busy modern parents while quietly filing you out of their lives. I am leaving everything to you, Hadley, because I want you to have the freedom to live a life that does not depend on either of them. That is the gift I am leaving you, more than the money. End quote. Wendell closed the portfolio. He took off his reading glasses. He sat down. The silence in the private dining room was the kind of silence that has weight. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then my father, finally, spoke. Wendell, I would like to see the full document. I would like to understand what my mother was thinking when she... Read. The full document is available at my office at any time. I can schedule an appointment for you next week if you wish. But I want to be very clear about something. Your mother updated this will 5 years ago. She was not confused. She was not pressured. She made the decision deliberately, and she explained the decision in her own words in the letter I just read from. The document is legally sound and the estate transfer is already in process. Hadley is the sole beneficiary. There is nothing to contest. My father did not respond. He looked down at his water glass again. Whitney reached over and put her hand on his arm, a small, automatic gesture of support, and then, after a second, withdrew it. My mother spoke next. Her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. Hadley, I did not know your grandmother felt that way. About me. About us. I looked at her across the table. Mom, she felt that way because of how things were, not because of anything she imagined. She felt that way because for 12 years, you and Dad both treated me like a piece of paperwork from your old life. She watched it. She wrote me letters every month while she watched it. She decided what to do about it. Tonight is not me confronting either of you. Tonight is Grandma's letter being read out loud in a room where you both are. That is all this is. Garrett had finally turned to look at me. His expression was the expression of a man who was understanding, for the first time, that the woman he had married for the past 8 years had a daughter she had not introduced into their household with anything close to the effort she had put into raising his son Tucker. He did not say anything, but I could see the recognition in his face, and it was not the kind of recognition that disappears. Whitney had withdrawn into the careful silence of a second wife who had just been told, in a documented legal proceeding, that her mother-in-law had viewed her marriage as the displacement of a child. She did not look at my father. The dinner that followed was short. We ordered food because the reservation included it, and the restaurant had already started preparing the courses. We ate in near silence. My father tried twice to make small talk and gave up both times. My mother tried once to ask me about my work, and I answered politely and let the conversation die. By 7:40 p.m., the plates were being cleared. By 7:55 p.m., Wendell was paying the bill on the law firm's account. By 8:05 p.m., we were all standing in the lobby of the Magnolia Room saying brief, awkward goodbyes. My father hugged me again at the door. He did not say anything about the will or the letter. He told me to call him sometime. I told him I would think about it. Whitney did not hug me. She offered her hand. I shook it. My mother hugged me last. She held on slightly longer than my father had. She whispered, "Hadley, I am so sorry. I did not see what I was doing. I want to talk." I told her we could talk later, when I was ready. Garrett shook my hand and said, very quietly, "Hadley, I should have asked more questions about you years ago. That is on me too." It was the only thing any of the four of them said that evening that surprised me. They left. Wendell and I stood in the lobby of the Magnolia Room for a moment. "Your grandmother got what she wanted, Hadley. The truth is in the room now. Whatever happens next is yours to decide." I nodded. I walked out onto Church Street into the cool October evening. The pale yellow envelope was still in my hand. I had not needed to read from it. The room had heard enough. The estate transferred into my name within 4 months. Wendell handled the probate process himself, and the transfer happened without a single contested filing. Neither my father nor my mother attempted to challenge the will. I think both of them understood, after the dinner at the Magnolia Room, that contesting it would have meant arguing in open court that their mother had been wrong about how they had treated me, and the documentation of that treatment, in 12 years of monthly letters my grandmother had kept her own copies of, was not something either of them wanted entered into a public record. I kept the house at 47 Pine Street in Essex Junction. I had thought, in the first weeks after the dinner, that I would sell it and use the money to buy a condo in Burlington closer to my mail route. But I drove out to Essex Junction on a Saturday morning in November, and I let myself in with the key Wendell had given me, and I walked through the small rooms my grandmother had lived in for 40 years, and I knew within 10 minutes that I was not going to sell it. I moved into the house in January. I have been living there for 6 months now. I sleep in my grandmother's old bedroom. I cook in her kitchen using the cast iron pans she left in the cabinets. I have her writing desk in the corner of the living room with the cedar chest of letters on top of it. Have started writing my own letters at that desk. To friends, to a few people I want to stay in touch with. To nobody in particular. There is something about writing letters by hand that I had not understood until I started doing it myself. My grandmother had been giving me an instruction every month for 12 years that I had been receiving without recognizing. The instruction was that you build a relationship with someone by sitting down once a month and writing the words by hand. I have not reconciled with my parents, not in any full sense. My mother called me 3 weeks after the Magnolia Room dinner. She asked if we could have lunch. I said yes. We met at a small cafe on Main Street in Burlington on a Sunday afternoon. She apologized, really apologized, not the partial apology of the dinner, for the 12 years. She told me she had spent the 3 weeks since the dinner reading her own copies of her divorce paperwork and the calendar entries from those years and trying to count how many of my events she had actually attended. She said the count had been worse than she had imagined. She asked me if I would consider letting her try, slowly, to be a different kind of mother to me now. I told her I would think about it. We have had lunch twice more since then. The lunches are careful and slow and not yet warm, but they are happening. My father has not called me since the dinner. He sent me one text message about a month after, asking if we could talk things over. I have not responded. I do not know if I will. Some doors take longer to open than others, and some doors are not yet ready to be opened by either side. I am not closing the door on him permanently. I am simply not opening it for him on his timeline. He spent 12 years operating on his own timeline. He can wait for mine. Garrett, my mother's husband, sent me a handwritten card in November. The card said simply, Hadley, I owe you an apology too. I should have noticed years ago. I am sorry. Garrett. I kept the card. Garrett and I are not close, but he made an effort I did not expect, and the effort meant something. Whitney has not contacted me. I do not expect her to. I am still working as a mail carrier. I did not need to keep the job after the inheritance. The house is paid off. My grandmother's savings are in the bank. I could have made other choices. But I love the work. I love walking the same routes through the same neighborhoods and putting envelopes into the hands of people who are waiting for them or not waiting for them. I love knowing that every envelope I deliver has the potential, however small, to change someone's life, the way my grandmother's envelope changed mine. I think about my grandmother every day, not in a heavy way. In the quiet way you think about the people who built you. I think about her when I make coffee in her kitchen. I think about her when I see a pale yellow envelope in someone's mailbox on my route. I think about her when I sit at her writing desk and write a letter by hand to a friend. I think about her most when I open the cedar chest under the bed in what is now my bedroom and look at the 144 letters she wrote me over 12 years. I read one of them every Sunday morning. I started this ritual in January when I moved into the house. I am working through them in chronological order, the way she wrote them, one per week. I am reading her voice across the years, slowly, the way she spoke to me when she was alive, patient, monthly, in no hurry. If you've ever been ignored by both of your parents and held together by one quiet relative who refused to give up on you, I want you to know two things. The first is that the quiet relative is doing more for you than you understand at the time. The letters, the phone calls, the small consistent gestures, they are not small. They are the entire scaffolding of your sense that you are real. Pay attention to them while the relative is still alive. Write back. Show up. The second thing is that the people who ignored you are not always going to get away with it. Sometimes the truth arrives in an envelope years later, delivered by a woman who watched everything from the side of a room and decided she would have the last word. My grandmother had the last word. She had it in a letter she wrote 5 years before she died, on pale yellow stationery, in careful cursive, and she trusted a small-town lawyer named Wendell Pritchard to read it aloud in a private dining room on Church Street, while the people who had ignored me listened. My name is Hadley Vasquez. My grandmother's name was Estella. She wrote me 144 letters over 12 years, and the last one she wrote me was the one that finally let me become a person who did not have to wait for either of my parents to remember I existed. I live in her house now. I write at her desk. I sleep in her bedroom. The cedar chest under the bed still has all of her letters in it, and I am not finished reading them yet, and I do not think I ever want to be. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe if you haven't. And if there is one quiet relative in your life who has been holding you together with small, consistent love that you have been almost taking for granted, tell me their name in the comments. Then call them, or write them a letter. Today, if you can.